I will start. Thank you very much for inviting me to be a speaker at this event. It's a great honor for Birgitte Svarre and myself that our book on how to study public life is now being published in Vietnam for the professionals and the students and the politicians. A little while ago, I had a birthday, and one of my friends, he made a cartoon of myself standing on all the books, publishing further books. And actually, we just published a new book called The Human Dimension, and that is celebrating, it is now 50 years since my first book, Life Between, was published. And actually, when we count all the books, including the Vietnamese versions of Life Between Buildings and of Cities for People, this new book of mine was book number 100. And now we come to book 101. That is the Vietnamese version of how to study public life. I'm extremely happy to see this project being realized in Vietnam. Why was it necessary to write all these books in these 50 years? That is because in the 20th century, there was introduced two planning concepts, two planning paradigms, which turned out to be very devastating for the people's use of their cities. Before the modernism, all the cities in the world looked like this. They were made by people, for people. They were low in scale, they were intimate in scale, and they were really fitting well for people. But then came modernism. It really took off after 1960 and became the absolutely dominating paradigm for planning. All the Corbusier, the French architect, who was really the founder of the modernism, he defined, as you can see in this sketch, that cities are bad and now we shall only build individual buildings. We shall have no public spaces. We shall have grass, as you can see on this picture. This is a very, very severe change in the tradition of cities, because until this point, all the cities in the history of mankind was based on spaces where the life of the city could go on, spaces where the people could meet, they could trade, they could have ceremonies, they could have possession, whatever. Everything happened in spaces. But then came the modernism and said, don't focus on spaces, focus on the objects. And everything which was not built upon was leftover space. If you look at the old cities, here is old city of Copenhagen, we can remember a lot of streets and squares, but only 2-3 buildings, the church and the town hall and the parliament, all the rest is spaces. If we look at new cities, there are no spaces. We remember no spaces because there are no spaces. What there is now is a number of funny monuments and buildings based on this paradigm of the modernist way of building cities without spaces. This change in city planning resulted in a goodbye for the concern for people and a goodbye for the concern for public space and public life. And also this change meant a goodbye to the knowledge of what is good human scale. In the old days, we always built in good human scale, but now people are many times floating in free air in these places where the objects are the important things and not the spaces for people. Another big change in city planning, of course, has been the arrival of the motor car, the car invasion, which took place all over the world, but again, especially after 1960, and people were chased further out of their cities. It is bad in the Western cities, like here in Bucharest and Romania, and it's even more traumatic condition are found in many third world cities. So people have, by new ideas of planning paradigms, been pushed out and made feeling that the cities are not for them. And also the cars have further pushed people and public life out of our cities. But public life is a very important part of a total and good life. If we go back to 1960s and we ask what was known about quality for people, the answer is nothing was known. But shortly after 1960, we heard from America, the author Jane Jacobs was the first one who raised her voice and said, if the modernists and the motorists are to form our cities, then it will not be great cities, but dead cities. She's really the grandmother, the godmother of humanistic city planning, which this is part of this movement. I will tell you a little bit about the story about my own life. I was as an architect in the 1950s, and I graduated in 1960. What did we learn in the 1950s in School of Architecture? We learned to hang over models and move objects around until there was an interesting pattern. And when the pattern was interesting, it must be easy. I went out of School of Architecture to do all these fantastic things, and then I had the luck to marry a psychologist and come to know more about social sciences. And at once we had all these questions. Why are you architects not interested in people? Why don't you in School of Architecture learn anything about people? All these questions, of course, because we in architecture and planning world had really great distance to the social sciences, but it was obvious that what we built influenced our way of living. In my case, I had to go back to School of Architecture to study 40 more years to find out what they didn't tell me first time I was there. I also realized that they did not tell me anything because nothing was known. So we had to find out from square one. We had to make the people in the cities and the people around the works of architecture, make them visible. In my case, I actually used observing, collecting data, and actually I began to study the life of the cities and the life around the buildings. And I sat there for 40 years and watched and watched and watched and systematized my findings into some textbooks. The first textbook was Life Between Buildings, came out 50 years ago, came out some 12 years ago in Vietnam, and has come out all over the world. Later on, I was asked to sum up all I knew in a new book, and that was the one, Cities for People, which again has been published in Vietnamese, much to my joy. This book is very widespread. In just 10 years, it's been published in 38 languages. Then comes the recent book, How to Study Public Life. It is from 2013, the first version, and now for the 14th time, it's been published, and this time in Vietnam. And I'm very proud and humbled to realize that this book and message can now be made available to the people in Vietnam who are interested in good cities for people. As a little by story, I can tell you that all my books have been published in China. And I know they have been spread out all over China because I've signed many of them. But what makes me, as an old man, a little bit sorry is that obviously they have not in China had time to read my books, but maybe they will find time and they will have cities which are more in human scale than these examples. If we are to sum up now, after 50 years of studying how to make cities for people, I can conclude that we know actually now how to make fine cities for people. The problem is very much to have this knowledge used. Data is very important for making better cities. And it's interesting that the councils, they collect a lot of information about some issues, but not all the important issues. All the councils, city councils, I know, they people which look after the buildings and put out rules for buildings. They are not always good rules, as you can see in these examples, but it is looked after. All city councils I know have people looking after the traffic and put out all kinds of regulations for the traffic. But who is actually looking carefully and lovingly after the pedestrians? Very few cities have special departments looking after public life and people. And who's looking carefully and lovingly after the public life? Make sure that the public life have a good situation in your city. And by the way, who is looking carefully and lovingly after the bicycles? There's really something which is looked after and something which is not looked after in traditional city planning. We have a saying that what you count, you care for. You have to collect data to be able to make a plan, to be able to improve the situation. It's like the doctor. He cannot start to cure the patient right away. The doctor, the good doctor, will have to collect data to make a survey of the patient. He will have to make a diagnosis. Then he will have to plan a cure, and then he can prescribe the medicine. You cannot go straight into the medicine. You have to have the information first to know what you are to do. That is exactly what this is about. We have known a lot about traffic, but very little about people. So traffic is much better looked after than people in city planning. What you count, you care for. There's been in these 50 years, 3 schools where they've studied really the public life. One was in Berkeley in California. Interesting and important books. Another one was in New York, starting with Jane Jacobs, but then William White and Project for Public Spaces have also made a number of books and studies of this and developed methods for studying public life. And then there's been the Copenhagen School. Copenhagen School is different from the other centers of studies because it has continued for 40, 50 years. It's made one book after the other, and most of them is about, more or less about Copenhagen, where we studied the life and got the knowledge and developed the methods. And this has had a very interesting effect on particularly the city of Copenhagen. Copenhagen was the first city in the world where the life in the city was studied and documented just as carefully as the traffic of cars was documented. And ever since, this kind of studying the people in the city has been followed up. And this has been very instrumental for making Copenhagen one of the most livable cities in the world. One big study came out in 1995, but actually these public life studies were carried out all the way from the 60s until now, and now they've been taken over from the university to the city. So the city is now having a department for public life and pedestrians and doing these surveys automatically as part of what a good city council should do naturally. Copenhagen has had a very interesting story because there's been so much focus on the public life and the quality for people in the city, that the city has seen a fantastic transformation since 1962. That is 59 years ago. The main street the traffic was taken out of Main Street all the way back in 1962. And at once we started to see another pattern of life, because life could unfold much freer when it was not harassed by the motor cars. Copenhagen at that time looked like any other Western city. All the spaces were filled up with cars, parked cars or driving cars, but all the spaces now in the city center all the squares have been transformed from traffic space to people space. All the canal streets used to be parking lots, now they are people places. Here you can see the rather dramatic change to city of Copenhagen in these almost 60 years. In the first round, there was only one little street without cars. Now there are many streets and squares and waterfronts which are developed so that they are good for people. They can, of course, some of them have some cars, because you can easily manage a few cars if you control it, but all these spaces have been made available, and that has completely changed the city of Copenhagen. Also in Copenhagen, they have now strategies for what they want with the city. They have this strategy: we will be the best city in the world for people, and they have a number of goals, and they have a vision that by 2030, 240, 250, the city should have these and these qualities for people. And this strategy is important because it's not about making the city center very charming and wonderful for tourists, but it's about making the entire city better for people. Here is an example of how the streets all over the city have been treated now. They used to be with 5 lanes for cars. Now they have 2 lanes for cars. They have street trees, they have a median, they have bicycle lanes, and they have sidewalks. And this lower street is much more beautiful, it's much safer, and it can take the same amount of cars as the other street, because the traffic engineers have become much more clever. Also, they have in Copenhagen now this principle of continuous sidewalks. That means instead of people stopping every time there is a street, they have this principle that the car should stop when there is a street crossing. And that means that my granddaughter of 7, she can now walk all the way to school on the sidewalk. Also in Copenhagen, they have now a complete network of good bicycle lanes where all generations can bike all over the city. This new network has, of course, made possible alternative transportation system. Every 3rd family in Copenhagen has a cargo bike where they can take their children around. The important thing in a bicycle city is the crossings, and these have been studied very carefully, and they have made the crossings now very safe, so that when my grandchildren are 12 years old, they are allowed by their parents to bicycle in all parts of Copenhagen. Also, to have a good bicycle city, you will have to have an interaction, and you will have to integrate it with the public transportation system, which you can find done in Copenhagen. For free, you can take your bicycles in the trains. They also have a strategy for bicycling, saying that we will be the best city in the world for bicycling, and staking out where the city should be 5 or 10 or 20 years from now. They put in many shortcuts and bridges because part of the policy is it should always be easier to take your bike than to take your car. And these bridges and shortcuts, they are very popular and makes it quicker and more convenient to take your bike. If we put all this together, we can see that an impressive culture of using bicycle has evolved. 49% of the people who go to work in Copenhagen, they arrive on their bicycles. Just 10 years ago, it was only 38%. If we sum up here, the lesson from Copenhagen is if you provide good invitations for people activities, you will have more walking, more public life, and more bicycling. It's a matter of what you invite for. If you make more streets, you will have more car traffic. If you make better conditions for people, the people will use the city more. And what happens when you do all these things to a city? You will find that the city becomes rated as one of the most livable cities in the world, as is the case of Copenhagen, who again in 2021 has achieved the top place in the list of livable cities by the magazine Monocle. So if we ask, can architecture change the world? Yes, indeed it can, but always remember that what you count, you care for. You have to study the phenomena you're talking about before you make the decisions. The doctor has to make the diagnosis before he makes the cure. So make sure to use a book like How to Study Public Life in such a way that you will have a better background and condition for making much better cities for people. I send to all of you in Vietnam my best wishes for your work. For people, and remember, what you count, you care for. I wish you all the best of luck with this new book, and I would like to thank the translator and the publisher and everybody who has made this book possible in Vietnamese language. I look forward to see you use it intensively. Thank you very much. That was the end of the input from Copenhagen, Denmark, where we have winter. Now comes Birgitte. Svarre.
I will share my screen unless there are any questions for now. Let's see. And now you see my screen. And thank you so much, Jan, for giving this introduction. And thank you to everybody in Vietnam for inviting us, for the translation, to the publisher and the Danish embassy. It's an honor to be with you, although online today. But I'm really, really happy to have the launch of this book in Vietnamese. It's a great honor. And I will go a little bit more into detail now. Jan has given the big picture and taking you to Copenhagen, where it's winter, as he just said now, but still with a lot of people out biking to work, to school, and so on, and also people using the public spaces. I will tell you a little bit about the tools. And Jan already said that it's incredible how little we actually know. And I think this quote from Enrique Peñalosa, former mayor of Bogota, is quite telling, that we actually know more about the mountain gorillas and the Siberian tigers, but Homo sapiens, people, we know very little. And that's, of course, the background for this whole book. And also the history going back when there was something missing in the 60s. Jan Gehl, the godfather, and Jane Jacobs and others said, well, there's something missing here. We need some tools to understand people, how they behave, how they interact with the phone. So that was the situation, and you can see them here. Jan Gehl at the bottom, starting life at Svarre, this main street in Copenhagen, and Jane Jacobs on her porch in Canada. And being truly important for this whole public life study approach. But also other people, and Jan already mentioned a few of them, and also that there's a Berkeley school, there's a school in New York, and as well as in Copenhagen. Today, I just wanted to highlight one of these because they all have different themes that they dive into. And Claire Cooper-Marcus is maybe one of the less known people of public life studies, but she's been out there studying the housing areas and written this book, Housing as If People Matters, and focusing very much on children as well, and the homes. And then I just wanted to show you this image because I think that reflects very much how it's been for me here in Copenhagen to have people who actually pay attention to your daily life, the quality of life, as you also said in your introduction. This is a program in the city of Copenhagen of greening courtyards. So also looking into those spaces that are right outside the doorstep, how you get to school, you know, the sidewalks, but also the spaces right outside your doorstep. Upgrading these courtyards has been a major achievement in Copenhagen, also for attracting families with children to have a place where your kids can play safely. But that was just setting the scene, and then I want to take you through some of these tools more concretely. What is this all about? This thing about measuring what you care about, the people, making them visible. How can you actually do it? That is the intention of the book. As you also said in the introduction, it's about looking and learning. And we have listed 8 ways of doing that. And I will just briefly take you through these 8 ways. And the first one is about counting. And you can go out and count everything. You can count, for instance, men and women. And in Bryan Park, they do this. They have a park officer going out there with a clicker in one hand and a clicker in the other hand. One is for women, the other one is for men. And then they have a threshold stating that if there is less than 52% of women, there's something wrong and they have to adjust things. So looking after whether everybody is there, age groups, but also in terms of gender is a sign of whether it's a public space of quality or whether there's something that need adjustment. In the book, you also have a lot of examples. This is one from previous days that Jan Gehl did, looking into streets with car traffic and streets where there's a pedestrian priority and not car traffic, and seeing whether or not the children were holding hands with their parents. And you can see a significant difference, and it's maybe not surprising, but still it's good, as Jan also said, to have these numbers to actually document that it makes a difference in the daily life of people, whether or not traffic is dominant and you have to hold on to your kids or not, and your kids can actually run freely in the streets and play. So that was one other example of counting, so gender, age groups, are people holding hands? You can count whatever you would like to count, but also documenting, as Jan also showed from Copenhagen, it's an important tool for documenting the changes. And here again, we have a little bit from the preface from George Ferguson that you also mentioned in the beginning. And in New York, the documenting of the changes in terms of how many people are staying, etc., was also a really important tool in order to take the next step and the next in renovating Times Square. It was also used to qualify in the beginning, before actually starting with the redesign of Times Square, to go out and look after whether children and elderly were there. And they were not in the streets of New York. And that's, of course, a sign of something is wrong. And then the question becomes, could we actually do it differently? Is there something we can change in the way we plan to make it safer for children and elderly? And anybody else as well. And Mayor Bloomberg at that point in time had a plan of a greater and greener New York, and also invited, you can see Jan Gehl, who is explaining which way to walk and how to prioritize pedestrians, and qualifying this whole plan. So it's not just a nice plan about a greater and greener New York, but also how can you actually do it? And that's the thing about this, that, you know, how can you actually do it using some of these tools to qualify, but also document the changes. And here an important statement became, as you can see, that if you looked at Times Square back in 2008, there was 89% of Times Square were actually for cars, and then 11% for people. And putting that to the table and then asking, well, is that how we want it in the future, in the 21st century? The answer was, well, let's try to change it. We would actually like to prioritize people, also to address other issues in terms of weather, climate, etc. But this was actually the situation in 2009 in Times Square. And then with the pilot testing out, well, could it be done differently? And immediately people took up the invitation to sit down and also to stand, as you can see, and use this public space in a completely different manner. The cars are still there, but the balance is better, and people can all of a sudden use not only Times Square, but also other squares and public spaces like Herald Square and other spaces in New York. And here you see some of the documentation that you have a lot more staying activity, which may not come as a surprise, but it's truly important to actually have this documentation of how people receive this. Because when it all started, people would say, that's silly, that's some European romantic ideas, it's not going to work in New York. But even in New York, they also would like to sit down and have a coffee and rest and so on. And of course, also important to see how the number of injured pedestrians went down on Times Square. More people would go out to have lunch and so on. So use the public spaces more. So quality of life going up and documented by these numbers. The same in Copenhagen. Jan already told this, but I think it's important just to emphasize how these tools have been an important part of the development in Copenhagen towards a metropolis for people. So really starting out as in New York and saying, this is never going to happen. In Strøget, the main street, as Jan also showed, people would say, it's never going to work here in Copenhagen. The shops will die. Our climate is wrong. We don't have the same temperatures as in Vietnam. It's too cold and so on. We will not be out there. But people were out there. And these tools were able to document how many people were out there. And not only in the summertime, but all year. And that's, of course, important for the politicians. That's also why we say it can be used as a political tool to bring these numbers to the table alongside with other numbers for traffic and so on, and actually document how people use the public spaces. And that's what you can see on the right-hand side, that as the number of square meters or square feet for public space go up, it goes up at the same rate, the number of people that are actually staying there. So 4 times more people staying, 4 times more public space for people. And then you can also go out and ask, well, where are people then staying? And that's, of course, also important. It's not just about understanding how many are there, but also really understanding. And those are the studies that Jan Gehl and many others did back then to figure out how is it that we as people like to use the public spaces. And here you can see how people, how it's important to have a good edge. That a lot of people on this main street in Copenhagen from these studies in the 60s, they would actually like to have their back protected and stand at the edges. So super important to have good human scaled and not too large public spaces, but really quality public spaces. Then I'll show you an example from Bern, the capital of Switzerland, where we also use these tools to document how many people are actually using the public seating versus the commercial seating. Because here in this central square, you had a lot of cafes and cafe chairs, but we could see that the public benches were almost all of them full. And you can also see in the background maybe how people are even sitting on steps and other alternative seating opportunities because there are not enough public seating. So in this case, we went out and documented how they were, full. So there was 100% occupancy at the public benches. And then you can see at the same square, there was only 60% occupancy in the cafe chairs. So we took this to the city as part of this study we did and said, well, there is actually a need for more public seating. We can see that it's full. So this became part of the decision-making process in terms of upgrading the opportunities for staying. Another case is from London, where you can see in the left-hand corner how we were out and doing registrations of where people were back in 2004. And there were a lot of people crammed in not too much space here by the underground. And the problem was that there was also a lot of rail and obstacles, meaning that people could hardly move around. Then you see at the bottom the new crossing at Oxford Circus, how it has been informed by this study, and the design has made it better and easier for people to walk here and a better experience. So qualifying the design. Then you can also go out and trace how people are using the spaces. And this is an example from Copenhagen, where Jan and I are sitting today. And this is by an office called Cope. They were to redesign Nørreport, and Nørreport is one of the busiest stations in Denmark. And what you see, they have traced where are people actually walking today. And then you also see the white areas, and that's where they have put in the final design, the bicycle parking. Because with all these bicycles, you also need some bicycle parking, and it had to be on the surface. And when you go there today, because of this is my conclusion, it actually works quite well. You have these natural places for the bicycle parking, so it has been informed, the design, by the natural ways of movement, by these tracing how people move about, meaning that it's actually working in the daily life. So informing design with the tools. So that was tracing how are people moving about. And of course, you can see a lot of different opportunities for doing that, or relevant situations for that. You can also go out and track people's movements about, be a detective and learn about how they move. And this is one of the examples from how to study public life from the late 60s, where Jan Gehl was out in one of these modernist residential areas, newly built with a fantastic, perfect infrastructure where you would have the pedestrians and the bicycles on pathways and then separated from cars. But somehow they could see in the statistics that there were still accidents. And how come with this perfect plan? Well, the reason was Jan could conclude when he followed Mrs. Fabrin and her little son, that people tend to take the shortcuts. So even though you had the pathways, when Mrs. Fabrin here and her son, when they would see the kiosk or the playground, they would just cross, even though they had to, take a different pathway, meaning that they would actually be in dangerous situations. So this thing about, also looking into how the perfect plans we make, also in terms of traffic and for pedestrians, how do they actually work in real life at eye level? And that's the goal of this, that we actually go out and also see how are things working, what is not working well. And we may have all these fantastic ideas and do fantastic design. As you can also see to the right-hand side, somebody did a nice design for the School of Architecture with grass and everything. But then again, architects are also human beings. So when they see the canteen, they also go across the grass. And informing the design with this knowledge makes it a better design. So we don't have to repair afterwards. You can also go out and look for signs of life and trust. I would say this is an example from Germany, where you have a front garden where people park their bicycles. They have some of their things standing out there, whether it's a barbecue or bench, things like that, meaning that this is not a neighborhood where you put everything away, but this is a neighborhood where you can see signs of life and trust and so on. So looking out for signs of life, how are people actually using the spaces, looking into their actual needs and understanding it at eye level. Documenting with numbers is of course important, but also documenting through photographs. So doing before and after photographs when redesigning places is also an important thing. And this is one example from Melbourne, where they with the alleyways in Melbourne, they've gone from backsides to lively, narrow streets, and no longer backsides, but part of the public space network. And this has been documented with before and after photos. So of course here they also have these numbers. They've also used these tools to inform and to document, but also photos documenting the changes. And again, also giving the courage to take the next steps and so on in this process towards livable cities. And then also looking after the nuances. And this is keeping a diary, going out and noting down when we're out there and looking at the people's use of the public spaces. And this is one example from a street in Australia, where Jan Gehl and other students have noted down what is actually happening on a street on a Sunday. And these studies give us really important information about how people actually use the spaces, what types of activities. And here it's not cafe seating or other inner city activities, it's in a housing area. So other activities like going out to empty the mailbox or gardening, washing the car, etc. are these types of activities taking place. So that's also one of the points in the book, that it's not only about looking at inner cities, but it's about using these tools for wherever relevant to understand better the life actually taking place, and then to build on that. Also to go out and do a test walk. Oftentimes we sit in our offices and we look at plans and we are writing emails to one another, we're in meetings, but to actually go out on your own or together and do a test walks and test the quality of the public spaces, to, in this case, test how long are you actually waiting here in Sydney at red lights. And as you can see on the percentages, in quite a few places, you are spending half of your time as a pedestrian waiting at red lights, of course, meaning that you get impatient and wonder, well, maybe it could be easier to take that car, or, you do not feel prioritized as a pedestrian. So how is it actually, at eye level to be a pedestrian? Do a test walk. So to sum it up, these are the methods that we have gathered in the book. And we decided quite early that we would have sort of old school technologies in there where you can go out with a piece of paper and a pen and do the tracing or note down how many people are staying, etc. So we haven't put in the newer technology, but of course you can also use some of that. But the point really here is to actually go out and have a look for yourself and see how things work and feel it, so to speak. And what happens when you're out there, you also get much more home than just the data, because we can get all the data we want in the world. But if we really are to understand it, we also need to get out there and actually do these observation studies. So something else comes home every time you're out there, some nuances and an understanding of the specific location. Because of course it's different from neighborhood to neighborhood, from street to street, and from country to country. So that's the point from Jane Jacobs, going back to her, that please look at these real cities, go out and think about what you see, and also from us to use it to inform the design and the decision making about the cities and what type of cities we want for the future. And of course, we are also facing other challenges, as you've also mentioned in the introduction, in terms of climate change and health, etc. And the lucky thing is that we can address all of these challenges by also putting people at the center of planning. And I wanted just to stop my or end my presentation here in Copenhagen with this quite recent example, which is a climate neighborhood, where we are struggling here in Copenhagen in terms of climate challenges with heavy rainfall. And this space, a local neighborhood square, has been redesigned, but informed by how people actually use it. So reorganizing the parking so it's not on the best side of the street, and here it's the sunny side because we are happy when the sun is out, and then putting in some program where you can actually sit down and walk about and so on. And then also greening the space, but not only greening just to have green, but also in order to be able to cope with the heavy rainfall. So this actually works. It has been tested when we've had heavy rainfall. So it works both in terms of climate adaptation, the climate challenge, but it also gives a quality of life to the people living in this neighborhood. And I think it's a fantastic example of how, if we sit down together, whether engineers, whether anthropologists, psychologists, architects, we can actually find new solutions. And part of that can also be these tools that can inform how we use the public spaces, how the life and the form interact to create better cities for people in the future. So those were the words from me. Thank you very much for your attention. And once again, thank you so much for all your work, making it possible to publish how to study public life in Vietnam.
Hi, can I make a question for Birgitte and Jan Gehl? This is Pablo from enCity Singapore. There have been a lot of discussions lately on the concept of 15-minute city, 10-minute city, almost 5-minute city that has been advocated in different countries, especially in Europe. And I wanted to know your opinion on this, because I mean, as I understand it, like city centers and dense urban settlements are precisely attractive because you have all the services all around. So they're already 10 minutes or 15 minutes kind of coverage of most of the services you need. So yeah, I just wanted to know your opinion on this, and if we are in front of basically maybe a label marketing campaign that somebody wants to foster, or if it's a viable alternative or approach you think is interesting to follow. Thank you.
Do you want to answer, Jan, or should I go ahead? I can try to answer. It was a little bit difficult to hear the whole question, but I think your question was around the 15-minute city, whether it's like a branding, more of a branding strategy and less about actual change in cities. I think whether it's called 15-minute city or 1-minute city in Stockholm, or, you know, if it's the Barcelona model, or, you know, there are all these models, but I think to me, it's just a sign of some of the same things that it's important with the mix of functions and the proximity to workplaces and so on. So I think it's to me, it's a sign of this moving up also higher on the political agenda. And when it's up there, you also need a strong concept. So I see it as such. And if you look at a city like Paris, there have been major changes. You have a mayor, Madame Hidalgo, who has worked with this concept a lot with her staff. And I think it's quite strong, but of course you can always, you know, debate whether or not it just becomes a smart, you know, a branding campaign. But I think not. I think you can actually see the change brought about by this concept. So I think at times you need not only a strong vision, but also some strong concepts to carry out change. So I think in that respect, it's strong, and you also get it as a lay person. You can understand this thing about that you have everything within 15 minutes. And I think to me, it makes a lot of sense, but it's also something I see as a sign of cities for people moving higher up on the political agenda in different cities around the world.
It is interesting to note that all the old cities were 15-minute cities. That is what you can walk. You can walk 1 square kilometer in 15 minutes. All the old cities were never bigger than 1 square kilometer, all the centers. So it's actually a city for people which is 15 minutes city. Nothing is new under the sun.
Agree. I mean, I think for me, the only issue, I mean, you mentioned workplaces, right? I don't think planners can't decide where people live and work. I think it's a misunderstanding to have the expectations of providing all the amenities and services as well as jobs within 15 minutes. I mean, cities are basically kind of labor markets where people just commute to the best location they find jobs, right? So that's the only argument I would find against this 15-minute model that usually also incorporates the workplace, not only facilities.
But I think that's also where you should, you know, take it with a grain of salt, so to speak. So the 15-minute city, if you make good bike connections or good public transport, you can bike quite far in 15 minutes or maybe 30 minutes, as I bike every morning, or 20 minutes. And even if you're on an e-bike or if you take public transportation. So I think it's, as you say, it's a concept, but of course you shouldn't understand that now everybody has to work locally within 15 minutes of walking distance. But I think it's more to be understood as a concept, but making a good connectivity in terms of also workplaces is super important, because we spend a lot of also CO2 on that account, and of course also with deliverables, and there are a lot of things to be looked into if we are to reach the goals we want to reach, also in terms of CO2 emissions.
Could I point out that the 15-minute city is really anti-modernist, because the modernists, they always said that one function here, one function there, one function there. So the whole notion of 15 minutes is to mix the functions, have as many functions as possible close in each part of the city. And of course, it's not realistic that you shall use, that everything you need is just here, but mixed cities are actually what she's talking about, as contrary to the modernist model of monofunctionality. And there's another little interesting thing here. There is a French version of how to study public life, and it has come out in Canada and French Canada. And who wrote the foreword in the French version? That was Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris. So there's an interesting link between that person and this particular book.
I have a question, if that's okay. Hi, this is Heather from enCity Singapore. I thank you so much for both of your presentations. They were really interesting, and it was really good to see some of the insights on how you study public life. And I had a question just regarding how you think street life changes in extreme climates, whether we're dealing with extreme cold or extreme heat. Places like, I mean, Singapore is fairly mild, but it does get very hot and very humid. But places as well, such as the Middle East, where sometimes it's impossible to be outside. How do you think that changes how we should design cities? Do you think it does change it, or do you think it just changes maybe the timing of the street life? Or I'd like to hear your thoughts.
I think that I would like to address this question. I have worked quite a bit in Singapore, and one of the things I was very critical about was that a major part of, in the new parts of the city, life was taking underground and indoors, so that to have climate protection, you have to walk in corridors inside for kilometers at end. They've tried this in Canada also very much in underground cities to get rid of the cold days, you get rid of the warm days. I also found that in Orchard Boulevard, Orchard Street, that when you have vegetation and you don't use the warmest hours of the day, you could have a rather nice climate outdoors, also in the evening. So it could be a matter of what time of the day things should happen. And I'm very critical of putting everything inside in privatized spaces. They normally are very boring, and after 30 years, they are really awful. So stay out as much you can, and then prevent to go out when it's raining and when you have very hot time of day, and plant many trees.
It's great that Dr. Tokian presented right before me. So it gives me a chance to build on what he already discussed and he's observed and researched on how, what makes a city livable and sustainable in the context of Vietnam in particular. Sorry everyone for this problem, maybe I just present this way. So as I said, when as a Western trained planner and designer, when I come back to Asia, my big question is, what makes a city a great Asian cities, and what are the characters that make that city sustainable and livable? So through my practice, my observation, and my own research, I come up with, I think, two most important characters that define our city, the way they are and the way that make us want to be there and be part of the city, part of the urban communities in Asia. Number one is nature as a framework for city design. And as you can see the image on the screen, to the right of the screen, that's a photo of Gia King tomb, the tomb of Gia King, the founding king of Nguyen dynasty, the last dynasty of Vietnam history. And his tomb looking over a mountain peak. And further away, you see there's two columns that really frame the view. And that remind me like the two columns in San Marco Piazza in Venice, that frame the view from the plaza to the sea. And here it framed the view to the mountain. And why this is the design of the tomb, like pretty much the same principle that they used at that time to design most of cities. And this principle is still very much influence on the city structure today in Vietnam, and I will talk more about that. And the second character, which Dr. Do Nguyen mentioned many times in his previous presentation, that public space, in this case, I'm talking about one that focuses on the community level as a community living room, a place that is very, tend to be informal, tend to be a transitional between public life and private life. So it's really a place that people all want to feel that they have the control, they have ownership, everyone in that community. And these are two important characters that I think when we are practice, if we pay attention to these two characters, we can really help us to create a city that is livable and sustainable in the new context of today. And I will talk a lot about that during my presentation. So first, nature as a framework for city design. So natural features are celebrated at monuments. So we don't celebrate man-made structure, but we celebrate mountains, water bodies, rivers, mangrove forests, and monuments. And we embrace them as guidance for the urban structure. We embrace wind direction, sunlight, and that many good examples that I will show later on is really become the guideline and is formed the structure for the cities. And let's have a tour throughout the country. First, what you see on the screen now is Red River Delta, and where the Red River flows to the South China Sea, the East Sea in how Vietnamese call it. And what you're going to see here is the light yellow color, the patterns, and that actually all the villages in the delta and near the river mouth, close to the sea. And this is it actually how people live in a higher land formed by sand dunes, and so to avoid flooding. And the green area usually the rice field, the farmland that they harvest. But by this way, that how the Vietnamese people moving closer to the coast, and building their villages based on the pattern that formed by the nature. Another example is a city in the north central of Vietnam. This is the wing to the north central of Vietnam. And again, you see the very interesting settlement patterns, north-south pattern, and in between are water flows. So again, this is also a site near the sea, and the wind flow has formed a topographic pattern that become the structure that define the structure of urban development in the area. And then when you move to the southern end of the country, this is in Mekong Delta, in Cà Mau or in Hà Tien area, you will see that this is actually a delta that explore with the help of machines. So all the canals are dragged and digged by machines at the end of 19th and early 20th century. And then that formed the transport system, and all the settlement are focused along this canal system. And that become a very regular and rigid system, but it actually still based on water and nature as a way of formulate the urban human settlements structure. And also it actually quite, it makes a lot of sense because it uses the land along the river edge, the water edge is where it have a higher elevation due to sediment deposit, as well as even the dragging process. They usually deposit all the dirt and form a higher ground for living. But I would want to say that we see those patterns not by accident, not just because I have a little bit choice of where we want to live, and we all have to depend on nature. We actually also very proactive in how we want to live in harmony with nature. And surprised to me that the biggest city in Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh City, the city of 10 million people, is actually the city that was formed on that principle, how to live in harmony with nature. I explored this when I was asked to write a book chapter on the iconic structure of Saigon, of Ho Chi Minh City. And I thought that the orientation was defined by French when they do the layout for the city center. and all the roads are looking towards southeast and northwest. And when I lived there, I used to live right next to the city hall right here. I feel it's such a brilliant idea because it makes the ventilation works so well. It's very breezy. If anyone live in the city center, they can enjoy the breeze, and also the avoid the no building that front the sunlight directly, east or west. But then when I explore and read back to the history, I realized that actually it's done by King Zalao and his team. So the king that I showed the photo of his tomb. So this is I can say that this is the very first map or this is the very first urban plan in the entire Vietnam history. And it was developed by a team of Vietnamese and French engineers working together at the end of 19th century. And at that point of time, they are defined as the citadel structure, right? And which is now become the structure that the French later on follow when they design their French quarter. And this record in one of the very well-known historic book, record the history of the South Vietnam, Trịnh Hoài Đức, Gia Định Thành Thống Chí. So is a geography or the atlas of Gia Định Citadel, which is the early name of Ho Chi Minh City or Saigon. And in this book, it clearly states that the king determined that the orientation of the citadel will be founded on the mountain or founded on the northwest orientation. Because to the northwest city, there's the highest mountain in the South Vietnam, Núi Bà Đen, which is a very sacred mountain to the king. And looking toward the southeast, where we have a mangrove forest, the very well-known mangrove forest today in Vietnam, Cần Giờ. And it's also, so it is really the form, the structure that looking toward the south, the mangrove, looking toward the southeast, where you can capture all the wind from the sea and backed or lean or have their back watched by a sacred mountain. And that's how they form the structure. But the king doesn't just look at those mountains and the mangrove when he determined on the structure of city. He actually looked at the landscape of 55,000 square kilometers. He actually looking at the watershed of the Dong Nai River, which is the longest river in Vietnam territory, and is flow from Lang Biang highland to the northeast of the cities where the city was today. And from here, the river flow down to Saigon and then end or meet the sea at the Cần Giờ mangrove. So one of the main boulevards of the city today is Legend Boulevard, and it formed the other edges of the citadel, actually looking toward that mountain, the Lang Biang summit. And another thing is important. This is not just about landscape. It's not just about environment. It's also about the philosophy of the people of the country. All the citadels in China or in South Korea are looking straight toward south, because it's written in the book of I Ching that the king that faces south to govern the country. But all the citadels in Vietnam, at least all of them, only there's one that looking down towards south. All the rest, maybe like 99% of all the cities built in Vietnam are looking towards southeast throughout the entire history, because we have the different belief system, we have different philosophy. Now in the north of Asia, the king becomes the king because he is Tianshi, the son of God, and the king has a relationship with God. So he beyond people. Now, and that's why they build a system based on what they call a pre-human universe. Now, Vietnam believes that the king becomes the king because people support him. So harmonizing is the key. So they follow a system that post-human or human focus or human-centric universe, where human, the heaven and the earth are three periods of the universe. And because of that, in that system, the bright direction, the sun, the wind, the best environmental condition is not the direct south, but the southeast. And that you'll see that in everything we do, from placemaking, from urban system, it's all about harmonizing, about accepting the imperfect. accepting the informality, right? Instead of having a like super mega block, having a gigantic structure. In Vietnam, it's about accepting what is here, what is there, accepting what people like and what people want, and allow for a mix of typologies, a mix of uses, a mix of big and small, a mix of formal and informal. And that's something very consistent throughout the entire history. Then let's move to another cities of Vietnam. This is, I would say, my favorite city, and this is what people can call a landscape city. It's Hue, it's imperious city of Vietnam, where the last king of Nguyen dynasty resigned from his throne. And when you look at this city structure, it looks like it's very unorganized, and we don't know, so how to determine where to stay and where not to stay. But when you put in a layer of topography, soil type, and especially the landscape, you start to realize that actually it's being designed and very well designed. First of all, the canal in the citadel, which is designed and is not natural river course, because the images to the right showing that how it's been altered over time to suit the new orientation of the citadel. And they all looking toward the mountains or the summit, because in the past when road is not in a poor condition, waterway is a main way of transportation. And therefore, instead of having boulevard looking toward monuments, landmarks, they're having canal looking toward monuments. And for them, the monument is the mountains. And then you can see that all the moat and all the rivers in the citadel, all the canals are looking all the mountain to the south and to the west of the cities. And another interesting picture is at the turning point of the river here, they put a beautiful pagoda. If you have a chance to go to Vietnam and want to visit Hue, this is a must visit place. And this is the pagoda, the view on the hill at the turn of the river. And I will turn you to the next slide. You see, this is the view from that pagoda looking upstream. And if you go take a boat and go further upstream, even the view is even more gorgeous, unbelievable. But that landscape helped to form that structure of the city. But not just that. If you look at the soil type, what I map here in this map, you see that all the settlements, the dark color, all the housing are on the darker soil type, which is actually the sediment deposit by the river, where the lighter green is where they have a lower ground and they use that for agriculture. So the pattern of city actually based on the topography to avoid flooding, and at the same time to let the area that can receive the sediment and the river, the fertile river water for agriculture activities. And this is a beautiful drawing done by students from UC Berkeley, trying to map the entire fancy or landscape system that define the structure in the city of Hue. And the tomb of King Zalong is just right here with the two columns that frame the view to the mountains. And that one example right here, looking toward the cave summit. But you can see that how all the mountain and rivers and the landscape help to guide the structure of the city. And then, as I mentioned, I'm a practitioner. So I'm trying to, when I'm practice and doing project today, how can I also learn and take from that tradition and know-how to create a city for today condition, right? And this is one example. This is a project that we're very proud of, and it won award in Vietnam and also in Singapore, that transform a place that's unknown, the place that is not, people not even aware of, into a destination for the local and a better community, and celebrate the heritage and nature. As we say here, this is the slogan we create for the project: celebrate heritage and heal nature. And right now, the area is full of existing settlements, civic building, churches, and a lot of agricultural land. And it used to be a place that have a lot more water elements being dried off because of all the greenhouses. So the city, the government decided to bring back the lake, which is, I draw the boundary here over the existing land use. And also we want to revitalize a waterway that connect and collect all the runoff from the surrounding mountain to the lake. And that become the major backbone of the entire project, not the road, but the stream that revitalized. And then we bring back all the community spaces along the stream and open up this stream, also open up the view to some of the important heritage in the area. Like, for example, this is Thánh Mẫu Church, which is a very old church built by the first people who come to that area in the 1950s. And along that green corridor, moving to the north, we realized that this is actually a very good lookout area to looking at the Lang Biang summit. That's the summit that the boulevard of Ho Chi Minh City of Saigon are looking towards. So it's very sacred. And we turn that into a place that where people can come and visit and can observe the mountain. At the same time, we bring in the character of the cities, both French influenced architecture as well as some of the architect influenced by the ethnic group in the area. And down to the lake, we also still keep the profile, bring in some public amenities close to the water bodies, as well as some community centers in the hillside. So that create a beautiful walkway from the lake up to the hill, and still make sure that the building people can still observe and see the church on top of the hill, which is actually a well-known destination, is a heritage building in the area. So by trying doing both big structure in terms of landscape, and at the same time reinvent some of the smaller community space to activate the area and attract people to move here as well as visitors. But I believe that when you look using nature as a framework, it's not just urban design scale. We can even think that at the strategic level scale. For example, here is a province in the Mekong Delta of Vietnam, Bến Tre province. And we have a chance to work on the vision strategic plan for the province. And we realized that this is a province that faces a lot of challenges because of climate change, from saltwater intrusion, so shortage of water supply, and also flooding problems, and also a fragmented water supply system. So many challenges they have to face, and even getting worse because of climate change, and also because of build up the hydro dams in the upstream of Mekong River. But the current land use are very rigid. It's defined based on production. Or it's rice, or it's fruits, or it's aquaculture. When we work on this project, we suggest that it should be a land use based on water resource. What kind of water resources we can provide to the people? So we start to design land use based on freshwater, saltwater, and adaptive zone where the water may change, depend on the season. And based on that, it's much better informed for the farmers to know the risk or the source of water they have, and what the government can guarantee for them, so that they can plan for their crop better. At the same time, we look at the pattern here, we realize that there's 7 patterns in the area, and we name them marketplace, Mitcha, or river place, Mitsong, or Midwen, mean orchard place. So they have different characters, and they are very interesting. And one important element of all these patterns or settlements typologies, that they all well adapt to the environmental condition. I give you 2 examples. One is Mitcha. Usually the city happens at the crossroad of many rivers, and they have the settlement along the river bank where they can connect with piers, ships, so they can do business, trading. But then they leave the area, the green area inside, and become it's like a sponge that absorb the water. So we make sure that when the tree grow, they still keep that pattern, so that instead of fill up the whole land with concrete, with previous surveys, we will keep some of the grain gardens, keep some of the open space, so that increase the land value and absorb extreme storm event for the city. The same when you have some of the settlement in the rice field area, they tend to expand from the road that form the structure, the backbone of the village, but then expand into the lowland. And we want to make sure that we guide them in when, as they expand, they will keep the lowest area in the middle of the settlements, between settlements, as open space, as a waterway, so that those can collect runoff and also even provide green space for the communities and help them to overcome flood risks. So that's some example and some learning from the past and how we try to adopt to the future. And the next point we are focused on is on the public space. So we have talking about how we're using nature as framework, and now how we design public space in the context of Vietnam at the community level. Right? We know that public spaces are the backbone of Vietnam's social life. They forming crucial communities anchors at all scales, from sidewalk to plaza. And we realize the public space is usually a transitional space between public and private life, between informality and formality. And that helps the community members to project the ownership of the space. And that makes the space very secure, very safe, and also ensure the place is very vibrant. People have their ownership of that space. So they belong to it and they control it. And here's some good example. What you see here is perhaps one of the most famous water pavilion in Vietnam, in Chua Thầy, to the west of Hanoi. So the same pavilion that can be used for festival, event, sometimes rituals, but also a playground for children, right? So it's not just formal, but can be very informal. And this is the photo taken during the hot day in the summertime, and kids just jump into the water and play with it. Another example, again, usually most of the village in the north of Vietnam, they have a pond in the center of the cities, and surrounding you have a lot of public spaces, public building like a temple, for example, or communal halls. So it is a place where they can organize events, meetings, festivals, rituals. But at the same time, people come here to swim every day. Sometimes they wash their clothes. So again, it's really going back to the idea that in the village, in the community, this is both formal and informal, and that makes it very vibrant because everyone feels they can engage, no matter who they are, how old they are, what they do. This is belong to them. And now we come to the place that well known in Vietnam, in Hanoi, Tha Hien street, where is thousands of people flood here, of course, during the pre-COVID time, for beer drinking, for chit-chatting, for meeting with friends, right? And again, all these houses owned by people, and they enjoy this. They turn that into commercial opportunities. They control the place to make sure it's safe, and they engage themselves into the public life in this kind of very small and dense public space. So this is a beautiful image I found online, and I think it's really elaborate very well that the sidewalk, no matter big or small, in front of the house, become a transitional zone. People will sit there in front of their house watching people. You see street makers, food vendors will be here. People coming to play, to chat, right? And even in the park, people take shower right here, right? So it's quite normal in Vietnam that even on the very public space like this, in the middle of the city center, you see someone just half naked, right? I mean, the man, that because they enjoy a cool afternoon talking to their neighbors right on the street. So the street become a very place that it blur between the in terms of ownership, in terms of private and public, in terms of formal and informal. And lucky for us, someone have done the work. This is the map that I take from a book by Professor Jan Gehl, who wrote a book called Saigon, the Sidewalk City. And we're very happy to announce that we will soon publish this book in Vietnamese as well. So she brought a team from of MIT students, planning students, came to Vietnam, and they mapped a street corner of Ho Chi Minh cities. And they map in terms of what kind of activities they have there over the time, and see that how things change and what kind of use they have. And she turned that the sidewalk here actually is a mixed-use sidewalk, and the sidewalk is a community place where they see a lot of not just commercial events, but social activities, and is certified as the most humane most human-friendly, right, and vibrant kind of public space that she found. And that redefined the understanding of the sidewalk. And even this is a very useful data to say that at what time, what happened and how much space they occupy. From food stand, they're most busy in the morning, less in the noontime, and not so busy in the nighttime. Parking consuming a lot of space, but then you see merchandise, entertainment, and also the spillover from the shop that in front of the sidewalk, right? But one thing she mentioned that based on her study, everyone work well together. They support each other. So it's really an ecosystem of people doing different business and different community members. They support each other. Like the food stand or the merchandise can store their vendors, their machines, their food, their goods in the shop, or they work together and if the shop sell the food, then the food stand focus on the drink. So there's really an ecosystem that is very vibrant and very resilient that support and provide affordable food supply to the city dwellers. At the same time, provide business opportunity for many SME, many small makers. So we bring that idea and try to interpret in our project as well. This is a project that we did for the city of Hoi An, 30 hectares, and we also using some of the nature element to frame the project from small to big, because I think scale is important. And in Asia, it's less about contrast in scale or use, but more about the harmonizing. So we always transition from the small scale water body to the larger scale, and then anchor with the mangrove conservation site. But at the same time, this is a better image to show that how we design a street, right? From a street that really like a shared street, mix of different traffic with a wide sidewalk for all different kind of activities to happen. And then we also at the same time to create some of the space that is more intimate for the community and anchored by some of the mixed building to separate between something too public and something more community focused. And then from there, we take it to a civic lake, the idea of the village point, right, where people can celebrate all the events. At the same time, we create some of the small hill to carve up and ensure the privacy of some of the building behind it, right? And at the end, we have a boardwalk that take you through the mangrove toward the sunrise in the morning. So that's why we call sunrise boardwalk. So it's an entire experience throughout an urban area, from very urban to very nature. And this is one of the rendering architect was done by Orchard. I try to bring in the elements of the local architecture. And I think here I want to highlight that the importance of landscape feature, even at a small scale in front of the building, because the building is so close to the sidewalk. So the landscape helps to transition into something more public. Same thing that one project that we designed and now is built in Eco Park. We will make sure the sidewalk is very wide and the community is really occupied. Why it's being used by a shop in front of it, but at the same time when there's not many business going on, people using it as a community place. And sometimes they can turn that into space for festivals. So again, the sidewalk become more than just a pedestrian place. It's a place for community, for event, for commercial. It's truly a mixed use. This is the design that we are trying to interpret how we bring in the elements of water pavilion into a modern community. And try to think how to provide more space for the commercial activities, for the sidewalk life to happen. And we just finished this work very recently and try to create a space closer to the water bodies, open up the view at the same time, more space for all the commercial activities happen in the place. Another view from the top, bringing water pavilion, some of the local structures, at the same bringing a more modern life, but combined with the traditional texture of the place. So I want to conclude my presentation here with the conclusion that with our many years of experience practicing in Asia, in Vietnam, designing, building communities, we think that there's two elements that it works so well for today and for tomorrow. When we're talking about climate change, when we're talking about globalization, it's about that bringing nature and use nature to define the framework for city. At the same time, at the community level, try to make the place that is really blur between private and public, that people feel comfortable to be. Like the photo you see on the screen, that here, again, there's no sidewalk, what you see in, no curve for the sidewalk, what you see in Tokyo. And the grass is just grown naturally, and the kids just really occupy the place and turn that into their own playground. With this, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you so much.
Yes, I think it definitely has a huge value, and maybe even more so. I think it can supplement, you know, you can use the online communities to organize events and have communities, but then we also see that there's still this need to meet somehow. And I think the pandemic has emphasized that, where we were actually told to go home and stay online, but we wanted to go out and also see other people. So there is that urge to see other people still. And I think if I look back, when I did my PhD, I did it in Silicon Valley, and it was quite interesting to see, you know, in all of the places in the world where you can be online, to see how much community actually means, coming together, also working together, that synergy of bringing people together, whether in work life or recreational. I think we just have that social need, and I think we've just seen that emphasized. But I think they can supplement one another, that you can also meet up in different ways, or even on my local street, we have a Facebook community where we arrange like block parties and, you know, Halloween parties, where we can borrow something, you know, we need for home and whatever it is. So I think these spheres can supplement one another, definitely. So I think there's this realization of that it isn't unnecessary at all, that we thought maybe some years ago, but really there is this need for the public spaces to be attractive, but also for us to get some rest from the digital world, that we can actually go out and, like we heard about, enjoy nature, the sensory experiences, that's becoming even more important in these days. So I think it has a huge value also in terms of health aspects, but definitely the social dimension is there. So luckily we are still going out in those public spaces, also in these times where many more people live on their own in a lot of cities, at least, especially in urban areas.